We're going to talk today about the history of African Americans in Washtenaw County, the history of the African American Endowment Fund, and we'll talk about why racial equity is still important and why it's one of the focus areas for the Community Foundation. Thank you and stay tuned. Hi, my name is Shannon Polk, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Brick by Brick, on behalf of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation. Today, I have as my guests Faye Askew-King, Janet Haynes, and David Barfield. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being so willing to adjust your schedules and join us. If you could just share a little bit about your work and what you do here in the county. So we'll start with you, Faye.
Hi, I'm a retired social worker. I was formerly the executive director of SOS Community Services and continue to serve on a lot of community boards and try to still be active. My retirement plan is teaching social work at Eastern, which I love.
Thank you so much. Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet Haynes, and I am a retired church administrator, actually, and choir director, and I am the chair of the distribution committee of the Endowment Fund, African American Endowment Fund, and also, like Faye, involved in lots of community organizations.
One of those being a very amazing choral group, am I correct?
Yes, you are. The Willis Patterson Our Own Thing Chorale has been in existence for over 50 years.
Wonderful, thank you. David.
Yes, my name is David Barfield. I'm the former chairman and CEO of the Bartech Group, which is a business that was based in Southfield, Michigan, that is still based in Southfield, Michigan, and I stepped away from that role in 2019.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here. What I'd like to talk a little bit about, particularly as a newcomer to Washtenaw County, is can you share a little bit of the history for African Americans in Washtenaw County? What you experienced, what you observed? I know, David, you grew up here. I don't know if you'd like to share a little bit about what that was like for you.
Sure. I grew up in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I moved to Ann Arbor about the age of 16 or so I had the opportunity to see both sides of the tracks, if you will. The part of town that I grew up in is the south side of Ypsilanti, which was the historically and continues to be the historically black part of town. It is a part of the city that has faced all sorts of challenges, including economic decline as black businesses disappeared from that community. We made the decision, my family made the decision to move to Ann Arbor as a result of some of those changes my parents wanted to make sure that the children were raised in an environment that was going to help us continue to grow and move forward without facing some of the unfortunate pressures of children on disadvantaged parts of the city.
And I think, it's interesting that you talk about that need to move in order to access other resources and, just what that means. I think about that as I saw people growing up in my community move to other parts where they were going to have better opportunities for education. Maybe there was going to be less crime and, just what that meant for those that move as well as for those that stayed. Jan, if you could talk a little bit about some of your experiences in Ann Arbor.
Well, I'm actually a transplant.
Mm-hmm.
I came here from Chicago by way of Kalamazoo, primarily to complete my education. So I graduated from the university in the School of Music. And I didn't know anything about the community. I was living in North Campus, student housing, and so I wasn't really into the community until after I graduated. And I chose to remain here, took a position at an engineering firm, and became more involved in the community. And actually, it was through the chorale that I started meeting more African Americans in the community and began that association and learning more about what Ann Arbor had to offer. I remember as a student coming down, since I was on North Campus, which is where the School of Music is, coming down to Central Campus, and I just happened to be on Central Campus, and I saw an elderly black man walking down the street. And it just dawned on me that I had not seen members of a black community. I did not know that there was a substantial black community in Ann Arbor. And so I became associated with Bethel AME Church, and it was through those two entities, the chorale and the church, that I began to become more involved and meeting more people in the community that were involved in the community.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, Faye, if I remember correctly, you also came. You have that Chicago rootedness in common. Am I correct?
That is so true. I am originally from Chicago, like Janet, and but we moved here from Canada. My husband's job transferred him here. Quite frankly, I didn't even find the black community until I went to Bethel AME Church, and it's quite fascinating because once I started working in Ypsi, it became clear to me that these two communities were so distinct. And coming from Chicago, I was like, okay, there aren't enough black people here to have 2 or 3 NAACPs. I mean, I just didn't understand it. But I came to learn that they were very distinct communities, and there was very little movement between the two communities unless it was around employment, for example. Very few people from Ypsi came to Ann Arbor even to go to restaurants or to the movies. And the same was true, I found, for people that lived in Ann Arbor. And so I didn't understand it. I thought it was weird. And I would think that the black community in Washtenaw County would have really tried to coalesce together because there's more, more numbers, more power. And so I was just really struck by that. And then once I started working, I worked with primarily low-income people of color in Ypsi. I learned that there was really such a strong commitment to Ypsi for those folks, and they really identified as being citizens of Ypsi and had a lot of pride associated with that.
And thank you for bringing that up. So, David, one of the things you mentioned were some of the systemic disinvestments, right? You kind of talked a little bit about that. But can you talk about it as an exec director of SOS, what you saw and what you observed that was impacting the families in that community?
Right. It was really limited access, limited opportunities. It was not that people did not have capacity, but it was more that they could not get to the opportunities that existed, which left them with minimum resources to really be able to navigate and expand their world, especially for themselves and their families. And I learned through my work that people just really need an opportunity, that people have capacity, and you just have to believe in them and give them the tools that they need so that they can grow and progress. And so what I loved about SOS is that we were able to do that. I mean, we created something called the Consumer Advisory Board, which really allowed those women to shine, and they helped with the plan to end homelessness in the county. They went with me to the state for their plans for homeless families. And so, give people the tools and they can step up. They can step up.
Janet, can you talk a little bit about what you observed? You mentioned, and I kind of want to build on what Faye just talked about. You mentioned, being on North Campus and realizing, boy, I haven't seen anybody else who shares my culture. And then by connecting with Bethel, a local church, can you talk a little bit more about that interaction and how you begin to build and find community?
I was in school with a couple of people that, one, Robert Blake, who was born and raised here. His father and mom were very involved in the community. In fact, the transit center downtown is named after his dad, Richard Blake, of the Blake Transit Authority. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Robert and I were in school together, and I was also in school with another person. But anyway, and she came out of Detroit. The two of them introduced me more or less to Bethel, and Robert, of course, was going to Bethel. That's where his family was. And I began to, and I met the pastor, Reverend Woods, and in fact, my master's concert was held at that church because of him. I began to meet other members of that community, and I think I went to a couple of things that were held at the Ann Arbor Community Center, which was a basis for the Black community early in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Learned more about that center, and it broadened what I was seeing and not seeing, actually, in Ann Arbor. I was being relegated to North Campus and only concentrating at the School of Music. I wasn't seeing the larger picture. Now, Dr. Patterson was my voice professor, and it was through him also that I began to see more of what was happening in the community or not happening in the community. And what Faye raised about Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor, I didn't learn about until after I had graduated. The difference between Ann Arbor, and I even had friends who lived in Ann Arbor that looked down on Ypsilanti, and I could not understand that coming out of Chicago. I mean, we were all there together in Chicago. There was not the separation that 23 made. And so that was really foreign. That was very foreign to me, very foreign.
I know when we initially talked, I talked about the fact that I have an aunt who lived in the neighborhood that's now considered Bronzeville. And so going over there and seeing that, and even, my own background coming from Flint, that there's just one community that I hadn't seen these separations before. David, can you talk a little bit about how the neighborhood that you were growing up in had changed, and then kind of what amenities did you find when you were coming into the city of Ann Arbor?
Sure. I think Ypsilanti today is a little bit different than the Ypsilanti that I grew up in. It's really becoming more of a cottage town to Ann Arbor, primarily because of the rising cost of living here. Ypsilanti's kind of going through this growth spurt in terms of its population, with folks that can no longer afford to live in Ann Arbor that are living all throughout the city of Ypsilanti. So there are some positive things going on. But the Ypsilanti that I grew up in was really divided into two parts of town, and those parts of town were divided by Michigan Ave. There was the north side and the south side.
Okay.
The south side of town is the historically Black part of town, which is different than the north side of town, where many of the white residents lived. And that line created division for so many things, including access to education.
Okay.
And the white side of town, if you will, was a fairly educated part of town. Eastern Michigan University is there. There are college professors. There are kids of those professors. The resources associated with that side of town were quite different. On the south side of town, which was historically the Black side of town, those resources did not exist. It was primarily employment through factories and things of that nature, and there's nothing wrong with those jobs whatsoever. But the jobs were limited, and education was limited, access was limited, and as a result, individuals were not able to realize the capacity that they actually had, and they were only able to work in certain jobs that required the skills and education that they had. I grew up in a family that was a fairly progressive family. My parents were entrepreneurs, and they were both in Ypsilanti through times of a lot of that economic change. And fortunately, they were able to build a business that stayed in Ypsilanti for a number of years and actually saw it as a strategic advantage. They made it a point to employ individuals from their community. They realized that those individuals had capability, they just needed opportunity, and with investments such as training and things of that nature could actually do well. So community service became one of the pillars of their business, as well as being good employers, and they looked for opportunities to pay their employees more, recognizing that they would stay. It now gave them access to better jobs. They trained those individuals, giving them opportunities to advance. and not only advance inside of their company, but also advance beyond their company by becoming more employable to other firms in the area. So they did their part trying to create and promote change. As the business grew, their opportunities grew, and it afforded my family the opportunity to move out of the community, out of that side of the community, not because of a desire to leave, but because access to education and employment and other opportunities they saw as limiting, and they wanted their children to have access to more. Thank God they were able to move, and we moved from the south side of Ypsilanti to the north side of Ypsilanti, to the other side of it, of Michigan Ave. And just like that, for me, all sorts of things changed. First, all of the black boys and girls that I grew up with, I left behind, unfortunately, and moved into an environment where I looked very, very different than the average, second or third grade student. So it was quite a change for me, and I believe it was probably quite a change for them as well. We lived in a neighborhood that only one other black family lived in. They were older, so I didn't have any black children to play with day to day. And for me to have access to those kids, I had to go to the other side of town, which is a side of town my parents did not want me to be on because of some of those changes. Drugs were more prevalent. Crime, as a result, was more prevalent. Some of those elements began to influence the classroom, and that was the environment my parents were really desperate to get us away from, because they recognized that if we stayed too long, we might be trapped. And so many of those families, unfortunately, are living in an environment that they're having a hard time getting away from, because although certain things have changed, access to education is still limited. The quality of instruction, I think, is different. And as a result, access to future opportunities for those children and those families remain a challenge to escape.
I just want to pause here. I've been working with some different people around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And one of the women that I work with, she's like, okay, she said, that moment where you feel the weight of it in your body, she said, give yourself permission to take a breath. Because what we've been talking about here, it's really weighty. And you feel it, right? You feel it physically in your body, this thought that, this decision that your parents made to say, that we are able to provide something different for our children, and it may mean leaving this part of our community. I mean, that is a significant weight in order to provide that opportunity. I think about that in terms of, as you were describing it, it reminded me of my mother using a family member's address so I could go to school on the other side of town where I was from, because she said, hey, if she stays here, she won't have the same educational opportunities. But if I can get her in this other educational system, the world will open up. But then I juxtapose that with something you said, Faye, which is, but when I talked with the residents there was such a pride in their community, a pride in what that means, right? And the fact that when you come from a certain segment of town community, other people may look at it and go, oh, it doesn't have this and doesn't have that. But what it has is it has friends. It has family. It has neighbors that are looking out for one another. And it has all these people that are hardworking, trying their best, exposing their children, their family to what is available. The issue is not for lack of want, it is for lack of opportunity. And you talked about your parents providing that opportunity by providing the higher wages, right? Training opportunities. And what that means, how do we make sure that those resources are available in those communities in the way that it's in abundance in other communities? It's not about getting people to move. It's about saying, what can we have right here that's within walking distance or driving distance, so they have those same opportunities and don't have to make the choice. So I'm going to say something and be very transparent here. One of the things I've noticed in this community is that oftentimes for families of color, they're having to make a choice between community and resources when they make a decision of where to live. And that is a hard choice to ask folks. And so I feel, leading the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, that one of the things that we need to do is help work towards belonging. How do we create a community where everyone feels welcome and that belonging is across the community? But two, how do we make sure that people that these same resources that we see in other zip codes are available across all the zip codes? Because one of the things, and I'm sure you saw this, and I'm sure you saw this too, Janet, is that every parent wants good things for their kids, regardless of where they live. Every parent, every child starts out saying, I've got these dreams, I've got these hopes. How can we resource them to make those hopes and dreams a reality? Because they have the skill set. They have the brilliance, they have the desire. How do we make sure that they have those things available? I know, Janet, with some of the work you did through the church, you were involved in helping to address and help improve race relations and bring some things together. Could you share a little bit about some of that?
Oh, wow. Wow. I was a church administrator for an all-white or predominantly white congregation. And that carried a lot of weight in that I felt what most black people feel, that you have to be better than in order to be looked upon as being almost like. And in that position, I was conscious of that every single day when I walked into that office. And I tried to remain very true to myself in how I interacted with the pastors, with the administrators the administrative people there, of which I was one. I had several people working for me, and I had a large responsibility over the finances of the church as well as the membership in terms of keeping membership rolls. It was interesting trying to be who I was and not to lose that and be who they thought I should be in that role. On the other hand, I attend and still attend a church that is socially active in peace and justice issues. They're out there at the forefront of many things that have gone on within the city of Ann Arbor, as well as addressing the needs of black and brown people in Ypsilanti. And that has afforded me the strength to hold on to my number one Christian beliefs in how you treat each other, and also to act out those beliefs in how I live out my job, my work, my life. And I found it in some ways difficult to do that as the administrator of this all-white church. But I managed somehow. I don't know how, but I managed somehow to do that. I don't know if that answers it.
It does.
But, you know, early on in my life in Chicago, I learned from my mom, who was an administrator with the Employment Service, that black people live two lives. We live in a white world when we're out there and we learn how to do that. And then we go back home and we live in our community where every day our community is helping us be able to be who we are.
And that's exactly it. The reason why I asked you all those questions, because oftentimes we only define philanthropy as big P philanthropy, right? Institutional philanthropy. But what each of you have talked about is how philanthropy shows up in different communities, particularly the black community, right? How it shows up in people going to work and nonprofits and saying, I'm dedicating my vocational life to doing this work, right? It shows up in pioneering ways and saying, okay, I'm going to show up and be that bridge builder and helping to share, and what does that look like? But it also shows up in the case of entrepreneurs of saying, you know what, we're going to start some businesses. I'm going to make sure that we're employing and providing resources to folks and really being helping shift trajectory. Philanthropy shows up in a lot of ways. It's not always that strong institutional way, and I think it's really important to highlight, particularly in the black community, how philanthropy can show up in a neighbor, right? Sharing if there's someone that has passed. It shows up in the caring for community in so many ways that doesn't necessarily go documented, but is absolutely critical to the success of the community. And
I think what we did in our newsletters for the African American Endowment donors was to begin to write about Black philanthropy and the history of Black philanthropy, and how for Black people, church was so important, community was so important. The church was rooted in the community, and that's where we gave, that's where we volunteered, that's where the mutual support occurred, and that's kind of the foundation that is built for Black people in terms of how we move through the world. And so, yes, I came from a Black community that supported me, but then I worked in the white community, but I am who I am, and so I bring that wherever I go. And so there's a specialness, I think, that we have as Black people as we navigate these different spaces and places in the world, so that we can really support and honor who we are as Black people, bring people along as we can, and then to help people understand who we are, and that we have a lot of pride in who we are. There's a lot of success in who we are, and that we are not just all poor people, and that we have made a lot of strides as people, given the oppressive environment in which we have had to live and grow up.
I would say there's more success because to get to the same place,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
you actually have to achieve more,
Yeah, absolutely.
including knowing how to navigate
Yeah,
in an environment that is not necessarily looking for ways to promote you.
absolutely. Yeah.
And it's so important, as you talked about, some of the things impacting your environment, it made me thinking of growing up in my town and, the things that even some of the folks that were involved in some of that negative activity, I was the college girl. I was college students. They're like, a college student, you can't be around here right now. We're about to go do some stuff and we want to keep you. We've got hopes and inspiration. We've got things that we're hoping come out of you going and doing these things. And so that sense of that collective support. But to the point that you were making, there's so many folks that do not fit into any of the classic stereotypes that are given. In doing some research in my own family, I was reading about where some of my great uncles actually started the educational system for Black kids in Mississippi in this community, right? That they were educators and professors at Fisk and Tuskegee. And that's some of the history that we don't always hear about when you're going to school in some of these situations. I had the benefit of someone giving me the book, Another Ann Arbor, to read about that history and hear about all of these folks that had done all of these amazing things in this community. And I was like, where are we celebrating these stories? Where are we talking about this? So that students from all across Washtenaw County can know there are people that look just like you that were doing amazing things decades ago. You may be the first in your particular group, but there are certainly people that have paved that way for you. I'd like to just pause here because I know we're going to have a part 2, but thank you for sharing some of the history, what Ann Arbor has experienced, what IPSC has experienced, what we've seen across Washtenaw County. Because I'll tell you, in moving here, it was very eye-opening to me to see that divide along 23. In my community back home in Flint, it would have been the I-69 divide, or 75, depending on which part of town you were on, right? Understanding what it meant to be brave and make those moves, what it meant to invest yourself in the community in different ways. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about what each of you have been involved in to help shape some of that collectively through institutional philanthropy. So, stay tuned.